So yeah, if you get the chance, please post in chat. We'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Mexico. Hello, Astrid. UK. I am currently outside of Boise, Idaho. Minneapolis. Brian and I were just talking about Minneapolis. Long Beach. I love Long Beach. London. Was just there a couple of months ago. I love London. Good places. Maybe we only have attendees from amazing places, and that would be fun. All right, who else? Where is everybody from? Some things. Welcome, welcome. Janelle, Malo, Michaela, Raquel, Renee, Robert, Jonathan. Thanks so much for being here. We'll wait just another minute as people join us, in case they are just waking up like I am. Thanks so much for being here. We have breaking news. So the world of shipping is another day, another headline, as Brian and I were discussing earlier. So we have some breaking news to discuss with you that happened at 12:01 this morning. All right, so we will go ahead and get started. We want to make good use of your time, and everybody who joins later will either catch up or catch the replay. So we'll get to this. Before we get started formally with the presentation, I promise we will not be talking a lot about ourselves the whole time. We will bring you lots of good information, but you may want to know a little bit about us so that you understand who is giving you this information. I'm Christy Porter. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Vector Global Logistics. So as the name is not too hard to figure out, we are a global logistics company shipping things from A to B. I am also the beekeeper. Any other beekeepers in the house? Please let me know in chat. I would love to connect with you. It is a difficult process. So congratulations, first of all, to everybody who's done this. We certified March 5th of this year. I remember that date clearly, getting that email, as I'm sure all of you do too. We certified so we have operations, we're headquartered in Atlanta, but we have 2 offices in Chile, 2 offices in Mexico, an office in Peru, and then team members worldwide. So we certified simultaneously between the countries, so US, Chile, and Mexico. And we are proud to say that we're one of just, I think, 4 or 5 freight forwarders in the B Corp community. So excited to be talking to you today because logistics is everything. I did not know a lot about this industry when I started with Vector, and now I have the news on all day long, not because I am a news hound, but because every hour something to do with shipping and logistics is on the news. So that's why we also felt it was important to you. If you're not in this industry, you probably have lots of questions. So Brian is going to bring you a lot of terrific information to help you understand why in the world we're here, how we got to this point. Everyone remembers a little thing called the pandemic that kind of put us all into spiral mode. So we'll explain more about that as well, and just let you know more about how shipping will be affected in the last few months of the year. So first, I'd like to introduce Brian Oxley. He is the co-founder and managing director at Vector, and he is in Chicago. So we'll let him take over.
All right. Thanks, Christy. Hi, everyone. As Christy mentioned, my name is Brian Oxley. We started Vector about 11 years ago, working in, well, I'll start the presentation so we can go through it. As Christy mentioned, there's going to be a lot of information, which be a fair amount to digest. I think can everybody see my screen now?
Yep.
All right, perfect. As Christy mentioned, obviously there's a lot that's going on in the global logistics. I promise that we did not plan or anticipate us having this on the day that the Canadian Rail decided that they wanted to have the employers lock out and the employees strike. So and we'll talk a little bit more about this and what the impacts are, but as of 12:01 this morning, the union and the employers had not reached an agreement, so the Canadian rails are shut down. And granted, the Canadian rails also service the U.S., but this is only the Canadian rail only the rail within Canada. So if your CN rolls into Vancouver to Chicago, everything in the U.S. is operating as it should, but everything in Canada, who have the union members that are represented by the Canadian workers, they are obviously not working. So what we'll do is we'll step through the presentation. Any questions you have, we can either ask, you can put it in the chat, we can ask at end, but we're here for the next 50 minutes just to give you a quick overview of what's going on in the market, what you can expect with everything that's going on in the market, what you can do to position yourself so that you have your goods that are going to continue to flow as it should. So as Christy mentioned, I founded the company with my business partner Enrique in 2013. We went with the position of we wanted to make sure that we partner with our clients to make sure that we are serving as an extension of our clients' brands and ensure that everything moves from point A to point B, as Christy mentioned, efficiently and cost effectively. In this, we'll talk about, again, the ripple effect, which, as we look at everything, the world has become a very small place, right? So as Christy mentioned, the COVID era was crazy. We thought that when COVID hit, we had the breakout in China where we were airlifting and chartering planes of getting supplies from the US over to China. When COVID then moved over to the Europe and UK, we were airlifting product over there. And then when it hit the US, obviously everything was coming into the US. So you'd see what was going on, a lot of strained supply chains, and everyone thought that this would never happen again, including me, right? However, you look at certain things that have happened since, and as people, if you've been shipping product over the last, probably call it 6 or 8 months, you'll see that supply chains have been strained due to the Red Sea conflict. But it's been obviously challenging, to say the least, to try and get product moving. So, let me step back. As we look at things and how everything is connected around the world, we initially started with the Ukraine war, had a large impact with the fuel that was being purchased by the steamship lines. So fuel rates were going up. It shut off the corridor from moving from China to Europe and UK via rail. So that was the start of it. Fast forward to early 2023, you had the drought within the Panama Canal. And for people that aren't familiar with how the Panama Canal works, because one would think that it doesn't make sense that you'd have to limit vessels across the Panama Canal if there's a drought because you're connecting two oceans. But the way that the Panama Canal works is as they fill the locks, it's being filled by a lake that sits above the Panama Canal. So when there's a dry season, that lake level lowers, and then they have to limit the vessels crossing the Panama Canal. So anything moving from Asia into the East Coast of North America and South America were limited because they were what they would typically move would be 36 vessels across the Panama a day. Had dropped to the high teens in early 20 and low 20s to be able to get vessels across to serve that part of the world. During this time, the ocean carriers became very smart during COVID, where historically they were very short on cash prior to COVID, so that as markets would fluctuate, they would try to announce a price increase, and then they would always rush down to try and capture more volume by announcing an increase and then dropping the rates to try and capture as much volume as they can. During the pandemic, they learned that there's a lot more price inelasticity within the market than what they had thought, given the constraint and the capacity constraints. So they generated a lot of cash, and they did so by at the time they shipped a lot, but throughout 2020, end of 2022 and most of 2023, the carriers would artificially pull out capacity to try and inflate the shipping costs. So, I think there was a stat where in October of last year, almost 30% of all the capacity on Trans-Pacific eastbound going from Asia to the US was pulled out of the market to try and artificially inflate rates due to a decrease in capacity. But nothing really took hold until we had the Red Sea conflict take place. And we'll go through a little bit of that in a minute. And then what we're currently facing right now are the labor issues. We had the CN and CP declare a lockout and strike this morning, which is obviously going to impact a lot of freight, not only into Canada, but also moving into the US and primarily the Midwest and the Ohio Valley. And then to cap it off, we have our longshoremen on the East Coast and the Gulf their contract is set to expire on September 30th. Although there was a lot of headway that was made early in the year when it came to the negotiations between the unions and the ports, the negotiations have slowed considerably, and there's talk of a strike that could potentially start as early as October 1st. So how does this impact? Again, going to talk about global trade, how it's ever connected and the ripple effect. What you're looking at now is a chart of or a map of the globe and how the trade is currently flowing and how it's projected to flow between 2025 and 2028. The size of the arrows, I don't know if my pointer is showing, the size of the arrows shows the magnitude of the volume that's moving, right? And so I think a key point to look at this is you always have very large arrows moving from Asia to the US, larger Asia to Latin America, and obviously Asia to Europe and the UK. What does that mean? Freight is flowing out. You have a lot of containers that are going overseas that are exiting Asia, but you have, with the smaller arrows coming back into Asia, you have a lot smaller amount of freight that's moving back. So when it comes to looking at the global footprint of empty containers, obviously everybody wants to get containers back in Asia, and everybody being the carriers or shippers to get it back into Asia to fill them and send them back out. So you have a lot of the backhaul lanes of sending empty containers back into Asia so that the equipment is there to get it out to the US and UK and Europe. Red Sea crisis had a significant impact on obviously the global supply chain. Time and time again, we'd have our clients sitting in Australia, in the US, Mexico, South America, and their position was, well, I don't understand. If there's a crisis in the Red Sea, why does that impact me as a business sitting here in the US? And what the impact was is that with the route that you see in blue getting cut off, right? So the typical route moving from Singapore, going through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal and up into Rotterdam in Northern Europe and the UK, it was around 8,500 nautical miles to make that trip, and you could do it in about a 26-day transit time. But with everything that's cut off with the Red Sea due to the conflict in the Red Sea, all of the carriers are now taking a route coming out of Asia, going down around the Cape of Good Hope on the southern tip of Africa, up around into Europe, and they also sling this over into the east coast of the US. But if you look at just the European route, that moves from 8,500 nautical miles to 11,800 nautical miles. And that trip is moved from a 26-day transit time to a 36-day transit time. Now, what does that mean when it comes to capacity, equipment, et cetera? So obviously, if a vessel or a set of vessels that are running the sling, when you look at roughly 14.9 million TEUs that are going into Europe, and then a portion of those TEUs that are going into the east coast of North America, that is sucking up a lot of capacity by adding that not only the 12-day transit time ish, but it also, you're taking equipment over there, they're unloading it, but then it's another 12 days to get back. So you're looking at almost a month of capacity within the global markets that's being effectively taken out of the system. So then now you're having issues with not only having vessel capacity, but then having those empty containers get back to Asia so that they can refill them to get them back out to Europe and the US. So what happens here? Obviously delays when it comes to transit times, a lot higher cost because you're spending more fuel. The steamship lines implemented a war risk surcharge of having to go around the tip of South Africa. And then obviously supply chain disruptions. So that was the kickoff. That's what kicked off a lot of what was happening when it came to the increase in rates throughout the year. As I mentioned before, the steamship lines, when they got smart during COVID, they were trying to artificially inflate rates, but when they would do so, the capacity or the demand was not where it needed to be to get those rates to increase. However, by pulling out that much capacity out of the system, with the carriers, with the work that they were doing, they're obviously able to utilize the capacity that was pulled out to push up the rates as they did. And so as you have experience if you're shipping, as you've seen, rates have obviously skyrocketed over the last 6 months. Moving forward, this morning, as we mentioned, the Canadian Rail, the CN and CP said that we're going to lock out our workers. The 10,000 rail workers said, all right, we're going to strike. And so all of this came to a head this morning. So if we have freight moving on the rail throughout Canada, if it did not cross into the US past the Canadian-US border, that freight is either slow moving or not going to be moving until we get past or get to some sort of agreement, whether it's an agreement between the two entities or an agreement by having the government intervene to try and push that. We'll find out. So the worry is what to do with the freight that's currently on the water and bound for Prince Rupert and Vancouver, which supplies most of Canada and the US coming through those ports. There was a labor strike on the ports in Vancouver and British Columbia last year in 2023. That strike lasted 13 days. And for every day that the strike or there was no work that was actually happening within the ports, it accounted for an additional 2 to 3 weeks of congestion. So, and backlog within containers at those ports. So everybody's hoping and pushing that this strike will end quickly and swiftly because they obviously need the flow of goods. The Canadian Rail is a lifeline for most of Canada and a lot of the Midwest. And so there's obviously a big push to try and get to a resolution. And whether, again, it's the two parties that come to resolution themselves, or if you have to have an outside party, i.e. the Canadian government, pushing to make that happen. So on top of that, just around the corner, the Vancouver longshoremen are threatening to strike as well. And then, as we mentioned earlier, contracts for the current International Longshoremen Association expires on September 30th. And so the ILA for this side represents all the East Coast US ports as well as the Gulf ports. So negotiations have stalled, so there's a potential of an issue getting, well, there's a potential of a strike and obviously shutting down those ports as well. So as you look at everything moving, the question is how do you get product in and out of the US? How does it impact the rest of the world? And this is where, I think it's important for us, and we'll talk about it in a bit, is to build duplicity within your supply chain and make sure that you're very agile to move to different ways and different modes if you need to, right? So what we have done with a lot of our clients is that, knowing that there is going to be a rail strike coming in, into, or the potential for a rail strike in Canada, we started pushing a lot of freight in via the US West Coast and US East Coast. Now, knowing that we have the longshoreman issue that's coming up in about a month and 9 days, we're going out and getting bookings for alternative routes, where if the East Coast is shut down, if there's still congestion in Canada, for us to service, let's say, the Midwest, we're aligning our client supply chain to bring product into Montreal via the all-water service. We'll then do a transload there, move it inbound in Canada, and then truck it to locations, such as Detroit or Chicago, Ohio Valley, et cetera, just to make sure we have a good flow of goods. Anything coming into the southern or the southeastern part of the states will be moving through Mexico. And then we'll obviously take advantage of the west coast of Mexico and Ensenada to try and serve the west coast of the US, because we know that Seattle, Tacoma, Oakland, and LA Long Beach will all be very congested based on how things play out in the next, call it 2 to 3 months. All right, so walking through these issues, what's happening? We'll talk about Asia, anything ex-Asia, so Trans-Pacific eastbound going to the US, Asia to Europe and UK. We'll look at the transatlantic ocean freight, a brief update on global air freight, and then obviously just talk a minute about sustainability and technology within logistics, given that the community that we're talking to right now is obviously B Corp. So we want to focus on sustainability. All right, Trans-Pacific ocean freight outlook. As everybody had experienced, looking at the Trans-Pacific, so Asia to the US, there's been a lot of things that have been going on. The Red Sea conflict had a big bump. Demand, which if you look at consumer sentiment, they continue to buy. The National Retail Federation has continued to increase their forecast on consumer demand. So there's plenty of demand that's moving from Asia to the US. Obviously, a lot of port congestion. There's a lot of capacity that is coming online. So as these rates increased dramatically during the first 6 months of this year, there's a lot of repositioning within the carriers' networks to add capacity to this trade lane so they can take advantage of the higher rates. And we also had 2 smaller carriers, Sealand and TCL, come into the market to be able to try and take advantage of the higher rates from Asia to the US. But what is currently happening now is there's a lot of demand that's happening, not only from just consumer buying. You had, with a market where the rates are increasing, and the concern that with the longshoremen, and a concern with the Canadian rail, a lot of importers were trying to front load and pull forward a lot of their freight, because they were worried about making their product not getting here for the back to school season, product not getting here for the holiday season. And obviously, if you're in a market where the rates are going up, if you ship today versus tomorrow, it's going to be cheaper. So there's a big push to try and get a lot of freight moved out of Asia. And then on top of that, the Biden administration had announced, in conjunction with a 301 committee, a series of tariff hikes on China. So they did a review as we went through the Trump era, there was a lot of tariffs that Trump put on Chinese made goods. And the reason being is because the claim is that the Chinese made products were being subsidized by the Chinese government, and as a result of that, the cheaper product landing in the US, it was not allowing our US companies to be competitive, right? So they went through and put on a bunch of tariffs on a bunch of different products. And that happened during the Trump era. In May of this year, the 301 committee and the Biden administration did a review of all the products again, and came back with another set of tariff hikes on a subset of items that are coming into the States. And they put it such that it's anything from lithium ion batteries to electric vehicles, solar panels, steel products, etc. And they laid it out such that it was set for this tranche of commodities. The tariff will increase from, let's say, EVs from 25% to an additional 100% within 24, another subset in 25, and another subset of 26. Now, the issue is that with the big push for EV, a lot of the lithium ion batteries are set to have a tariff hike within the US sometime in 24, but that date has not been confirmed yet as to when it will actually happen. As a result of that, all the EV battery manufacturers in China are pushing to get as much product from China landed in the US before that start date of the increased tariff takes effect. Because the current duty rate on an EV battery is 3.8%. And with the additional tariffs, it's going to take it up an additional, I think it's 25%. So obviously, it's going to move from an additional 7.5% to an additional 25% of the additional tariff on top of the 3.8% duty rate. So everybody's trying to land it in the US as fast as they can to avoid paying the additional tariff. So as such, a lot of freight's coming out of Asia and specifically China that's eating up a lot of capacity. And I think one quick note on that is, again, going back to how minor things can happen in the global shipping and create a ripple effect. As you may or may not have seen, a couple weeks ago, there was an explosion on the ship, the Yangming Mobility in Ningbo. Ningbo is currently the third largest port in the world, and it shut the port down for a week. So obviously all the freight going out had to go out of adjacent ports. And with that explosion, it was due to the vessel carrying a lot of lithium ion batteries and a specific chemical compound. So obviously there's a lot more scrutiny on hazmat material being moved around the world because of that. Looking at the volatility within Asia and North America, I would expect the volatility to remain the same. If you look at historical rates, with the exception of 2020, because we had the start of COVID with the lull of the rates, because everybody at the time believed the world was shutting down, and then it came roaring back. When you look at shipping post the Golden Week, which is the first week of October, rates have historically always come down after Golden Week, except for 2020. So what does that mean for this year? Our position is that, not accounting for the labor strikes, the rail strikes, etc., rates, we're hoping and planning on them coming down. So as you can see from the chart down below on the Shanghai Container Freight Index, rates shot up during the first half of this year. They have started to recede. The hope and thought was that they would continue to recede after the Golden Week in October. But if the strikes with the rail remain in play, and if the strikes happen on the East Coast, then obviously that throws everything out the window. So as you look at demand, obviously we have strong demand as it continues. We still have that seasonal surge, which the peak season started earlier. The National Retail Federation, as I mentioned, has very strong consumer sentiment, and they've increased their forecast on what retailers are selling and consumers are buying in the US. And then obviously demand may shift due to the push of moving from offshoring to nearshoring, right? So with a lot of the tariffs and that geopolitical landscape of slapping tariffs on on Chinese made goods. A lot of products are being, and we're moving a lot of plants from Asia and from specifically from China into Mexico, so that they can take advantage of the cross-border trade and not have to pay the duty rates due to the free trade agreement that the US has with Canada and Mexico. When it comes to the supply side, obviously capacity is going to continue to be tight. Operational limits with the strikes and lockouts, routings will change, vessels will be diverted, and it'll be a matter of trying to figure out how is the best, cheapest, and most efficient way to get product here in the States as a result of that. And then obviously the regulatory impact is going to play a role in everything. Looking at seasonal patterns for Asia to Europe, same thing when it came to the Red Sea, but more directly impacted. As everybody had seen in Europe, in the UK, prices have gone up. You also had longer transit times, which was obviously impacting your supply chain. And you had smaller items, right? Like in the UK, you had the rail strike rail strike and port strikes in Felixstowe and Southampton that forced us to divert product to adjacent ports. But what we've seen over the past month is that the ocean shipping rates have decreased and are starting to soften as they're coming off that peak season. We're expecting steady volume moving from Asia to the UK and Europe, despite the softening market. Port congestion issues, high volume earlier in the year has created significant delays. And a lot of people think back to the Red Sea conflict. As soon as the Red Sea opens back up, whenever that might be, that will be a good thing in the long term. But in the near term, you have all the vessels that are coming down around the Cape of Good Hope. And once the Red Sea opens up, it's going to open up the floodgates. So you have not only the vessels that are having the quicker transit time to get through the Red Sea, you're going to have the vessels that are already on the water coming around going to, say, Rotterdam. And you're going to have twice as many vessels hitting at the same time, which is going to create a lot of port congestion within the European and the UK trade. And so once that happens, the port congestion is going to be significant. And I expect it'll take probably 3 months to work through that backlog to get everything back to normal once the Red Sea opens again. And so what can you do from an Asia Pacific standpoint? And moving stuff from Asia to the US, yeah, you can go as far as what we're doing with some of our clients in terms of relocating plants. Absent that and keeping everything moving out of Asia, just making sure you're working closely with the suppliers and your forwarders so that everything moves quickly, everything moves as it should. Make sure that you're working closely with the factories when it comes to the ready dates so that you can book as far out as possible. So typically carriers will allow bookings 3 to 4 weeks out, and it's going to be very important to secure space. And also on top of that, not only to secure the space, but you have to work closely with your providers and your suppliers because the carriers have implemented a cancellation fee such that if you book something and you don't use that freight or don't use that spot, you will get charged a cancellation fee. So it's very important to have good communication with everybody involved with the supply chain. Look at diversifying routes, whether it's looking at alternative ports to come into, trying to get around the rail strikes, the East Coast and Gulf port strikes, et cetera. Take a look at not only your supply chain, but what is going to be the best way to get it there today may not be the best way to get it there tomorrow. And then based on what tomorrow looks like, truly understand what those transit times are going to be, and then build in a little bit of conservative numbers so that you're not going to be caught without product in your hands to be able to sell to your customers and clients. So monitor regulatory changes, whether it's the EU, the European trading system when it comes to the push to become greener with the steamship lines, to the different tariff impacts in the US. And then obviously leverage technology. So there's a lot of good data out there to be able to capture, analyze, and understand what is the best way to move your product from A to B. So and then obviously you want to make sure that you have a resilient supply chain. So we'll push on to transatlantic. Transatlantic westbound ocean freight. So anything coming from Europe and UK coming into the US, obviously moving product into Halifax. There's some great services out there that serve the Midwest. Halifax obviously is impacted with Canadian Rail. So currently, if you haven't already done so, moving from Europe and UK into the US and vice versa, you're looking at alternative routes. And again, back to my point earlier, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, making sure you're booking early and booking often to avoid these issues. So when you look at the way global supply and global trade runs, it's people will rush to it's often a knee-jerk reaction, and if you don't have adequate planning, it's often done too late, right? So if you don't have bookings in place now, 3 and 4 weeks out, when something happens like the rail strike, everybody now is scrambling to try and get freight that does not touch a Canadian rail within Canada, which it's likely too late from a booking standpoint. So making sure that you're booking far enough out is exactly where you need to be. Capacity issues when it comes to transatlantic westbound. Carriers are managing the surplus capacity by implementing blank sailings. They're working on adjusting their fleet, adjusting their rotations, and then obviously they're definitely going to play into the capacity issue of the Canadian rail strike. And so for North America shipping coming from transatlantic westbound, we were up 7% in the first half of 24. So a lot of product and goods are flowing from Europe and UK to North America. Anticipate that this will continue up to the holiday stocking season. And then obviously things we need to watch out for from an external factor, the labor disputes and the and potential strikes on the East Coast affecting the inbound and also outbound shipments. So what's the impact of everything that's going on right now is obviously service reliability. As mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that you have a lot of buffer built into your supply chain to take advantage of the increased transit times, increased delays within the ports, so that you make sure that you're getting product into your possession and obviously in your clients and consumers' possession as soon as possible. Eastbound, same thing. A lot of congestion that's happening in Europe. Germany, potential strikes in Hamburg and Bremerhaven, with the potential for further disruptions, including the risks of union actions from the East Coast. A lot of schedule changes and adjustments are happening. For example, MSC halted Oceania shipments. And you want to make sure that you are focused on, again, building in the duplicative way of shipping your product from point A to point B. So, sorry, implementing duplicity is what I was trying to say. And then looking at rates have surged. They're starting to come down a little bit. As you can see that there was a pop and now it's starting to come down, but rates have stabilized. I feel as though that the rates will come down. Obviously, once we're past the labor issues and once we're past the peak season. We touched on a lot of this stuff similar to what was happening for what you could do for your strategic actions for success. Book early, book often, prepare for the delays and anticipate delays, and just understand what are your options should your common trade lane or common routes become not available. Global overview for air freight. We'll touch briefly on this. Obviously, with this tight capacity and issues in the market, you'll have the last thing that you want to do, or hopefully the last thing you want to do is have to pay a lot for air freight, because air freight, when people need it, people have to pay for it, and it's very expensive relative to shipping via ocean, right? But when it comes down to not having an alternative option, it puts a lot of shippers and importers in a bind with the additional costs. So make sure that you're obviously taking into account your supply chain from an ocean shipping, and then use air freight where you need to, but just have a solid understanding that if you're needing to do it, a lot of everybody else needs to do it as well, and it will impact the capacity, will impact the rates, in trying to get your product to where it needs to go. So Asia to Europe, obviously there's a lot of tight capacity right now, so there's limited air cargo space due to the global disruptions. There's a high utilization rate within the aircraft. Demand has increased and continues to increase. A lot of it's driven by e-commerce, and obviously rate increases due to the fixed capacity. When it comes to North America and Europe, e-commerce is still driving a lot of a lot of the air freight that's moving over. And obviously air freight is happening just to get around the bottlenecks during peak season and around the bottlenecks of the issues that we've talked about before when it comes to landing product in the US. When it comes to shipping via air, I'd really focus on, if you have to, look at implementing kind of a two-part strategy, right? Where it's, you want to be able to ship air to supply the immediate need of your clients, and beyond the immediate need of your clients, at the same time, try and push ocean freight in where you can, so that your air freight is filling the gap while your ocean freight gets here, because obviously it's going to be a lot more economical to move that ocean freight into the US. And so make sure you're leveraging different modes of transportation by combining the air and ocean and ground transport to land it where you need to go. Also, with a lot of the congestion, make sure that you're booking on the higher priority service, because people will want to not pay a certain level, and they'll pay for air freight on a reserve service. So you're paying a lot of money to air freight it. But if you're on a reserve service, higher paying freight, if there's if at whatever airport, if it's a direct or indirect, if there's higher paying freight, it will move before your freight does. So there's nothing worse than paying tens of thousands of dollars for air freight to get to a certain airport. And then if you're on a reserve service because it wasn't booked correctly, higher paying freight will move before yours, which is obviously where you do not want to be. And then obviously look at, when it comes to the air freight, the most expensive part is moving the air freight from overseas to wherever you need to go. So take a look at where you want to land it, look at options where you can find capacity and cheaper air freight rates, because if you can land it in the US and truck it to where you need to go, the trucking portion is going to be a lot cheaper than the actual air portion. So look at those options as well. So with that, obviously we're in some tough times, a lot of disruptions in the global market, but obviously the key is to keep a good pulse on the market, work closely with your suppliers, work closely with your transportation providers, and staying agile, and being able to shift as things need. And then the final point on the call is just around sustainability. So there's been a big push through the IMO 2023 is the latest, where it's the push for ocean carriers to use low sulfur fuel. There is now a rating system that went into effect last year, that if certain vessels don't meet a certain criteria from a carbon monoxide emissions standpoint, or carbon dioxide emissions standpoint, they have to either retrofit, add scrubbers, change the engine, or scrap the vessel and get new vessels, so that we are greener, right? So you'll look at this focus of between now and 2040 is when they're hoping to have it fully implemented. From a steamship line standpoint, we also have the European trading system within the steamship line, so that anything that is coming into the European ports it's based on how long of a haul the steamship line had made from the previous port to a European port, and then they calculate a tax on that based on the greenhouse emissions that it's pushing out. So in terms of looking at all that, I would play a part in making sure that you're trying to be green. Take a look at the carbon footprint that you're pushing, and then see what you can do to try and offset some of those the carbon through some carbon offset program. So with that, I know that there was a lot of information. We also have an insight report that Christy and Nuria can send if you're interested. Take a look at how to maximize your efficiency, how to minimize your carbon footprint, et cetera. And feel free to reach out and have any information. If you have any information or any questions around that, please reach out to them. And that brings me to the end of our presentation. So if I'd like to open up the floor for anybody that has any questions, thoughts, comments. But I just want to take a moment and say thank you for your time. Hopefully that this was helpful. And if you have any questions, my email is on the screen and you can feel free to reach out to me at any time.
Thanks, Brian. I'll go ahead. We had some people come in late. So one of the things we tackled at the very beginning that I'd like you to reiterate as sort of a 101 is things like the Ukraine war, Red Sea, all of those. If people are not shipping directly through those routes, they may be wondering how those affect them, why those affect them. Can you give a brief explanation of that?
Around, yeah, why,
You're not shipping there. Why does it matter?
yeah, why does it matter? All right, let me go back to sharing my screen. It's, yeah, so it's, let's see, let me go back to this share. I think the best thing to look at for those who join late, why it matters, looking at this picture here, right, I think is the best graphic where it shows slideshow. Why does it impact the US if it's not touching the US? If you look at the transit time of moving stuff from Asia to Europe, what typically was a 26-day transit time is now a 36-day transit time just to go one way. So in order to get the ships over and then the ships back to Asia to fill them up again, them being the vessels and the containers, you're adding, almost 20 to 25 days, which is taking capacity out of the global system. And with taking capacity out of the system is what the carriers love, right? Because at the end of the day, you cannot move product around the world in mass quantities if you don't put it on a vessel, right? And so, or at least going from continent to continent, I should say. And so if the carriers can play with capacity and restrict capacity, whether it's artificially or through actual capacity constrictions with the vessels taking longer time and not having that free capacity to move product around the world, it's pulling capacity out of vessels moving to the US. It's limiting the number of empty containers that are in Asia to get from Asia to the US, which is all pushing the rates higher. So
thank you. And we covered obviously a lot of information in a short amount of time, including the Canadian rail strike, which just came into effect almost 10 hours ago. Can you also just recap and give maybe 3 takeaways for people?
Yeah, so for the rail strike, I would say the key takeaway is well, actually, I don't know if I need to do 3. I'll give you 1. Okay. The key thing is to make sure that you have a dynamic supply chain and keep a pulse on the market and understand if something happens or something that could happen, what can I do to maintain my supply chain? And if you're thinking about it now, so is everybody else. And so make sure that you're putting in that duplicative supply chain strategy that you have your plan A and your plan B. So for us, when it comes to shipping, let's say Chicago to the UK, our preferred route is to go from Chicago to Halifax and over to Felixstowe because the transit time is about 10 days from rail ramp to port. However, knowing that the rail strike was coming up, or a potential for the rail strike was coming up, we've booked not only all of our freight or had bookings in place for our regular route, we also had bookings in place to go via New York, so that wouldn't touch the Canadian rail. And we booked out as far as we could, knowing that, and again, we don't have this issue in the US, similar to what it is in Asia, where if you cancel a booking, you have to pay for a cancellation fee. Where we are now in the US is we're booking both. We're booking as far out as possible so that should something happen like this rail strike, we can push all of our freight out the other way and cancel our bookings via Halifax. So the key takeaway on everything is understand your markets, understand the pulse of what's going to happen, or even, or better yet, the threat of what may happen, and make sure you have contingency planning in place.
Yes, and I would also add to have a supply chain partner that you can trust, that if you have a very small team and are not able to stay updated on the latest headlines, then somebody is out there looking out for you. So it doesn't have to be us, but just make sure you have a supply chain partner you can trust. And in the insights report, and the link is in chat, we give you a guide, actually a step-by-step checklist on choosing your ideal logistics partner. So please take advantage of that. As mentioned, we will send the recording and the presentation out so that you can read through it all again, digest it, ask questions. We're here and available to do that and share with anybody else you need as well. Before we go, do we have any questions? I know it can sometimes be intimidating to ask in a group. Okay. Well, again, thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate it. We will send everything out by email, and we're here to help. So please ask. Thank you for all your hard work. We may not know you personally, but we know you're a B Corp, and that means you've worked really hard to get where you are, and you're out there using business as a force for good. So thank you for all that you do. And please let us know if you have any questions or need anything else. We're here to be a reference however we can. Thanks so much for your time, everybody.
Yeah, I would say that we love logistics. So it may be boring for you, but we really enjoy it. So if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to reach out. So, and thank you everybody for your time.
Thank you, everyone.